I'm the curator of the Japanese collections here at the British Museum, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar today on the starting point for our discussion today is a group of 103 drawings by the Japanese artist Katsushika Hokusai that were produced from the late 1820s to the 1840s, we believe. And they are entitled The Great Picture Book of Everything. And even in that title, you can see the ambitious scope of this project that we see Hokusai aiming for. And they're being featured in a special exhibition at the British Museum, open now already, that runs through until January. These drawings emerged from a private collection in France in 2019 and were acquired for the British Museum by the generosity of a bequest from Theresia Gerda Buch in memory of her parents, Rudolph and Julie Buch, and for a grant from the Art Fund. Just a little prompt, oops, back. I'm trying to go back a slide, so I'm just calling on our technical team there. Nope. Supposed to be going the other way. Nope. There we go. This was an overview of a large proportion of the drawings, just to give you a sense of the plenitude, the sheer number of these drawings. And here is a little a close-up of them. The three main areas for the content of the drawings are China, India, and the natural world. But it's important to explain that these broad subject areas are presentations of mythological and religious figures from these distant lands, sometimes historical figures, not landscape views. These are not views of the countries themselves, but people, important figures from those lands. The drawings are block-ready drawings, in Japanese hanshitai, the final clean copy of designs used to make the printing block, from which the book pages would then be printed. These escaped the block cutter's chisel, as the book for some reason was never published. Based on research by Timothy Clark, Honorary Research Fellow at the British Museum, we now understand that these drawings were designed as a reference book, possibly part of a much larger project to create a comprehensive picture encyclopedia. And the drawings are filled with Hokusai's characteristic vitality and imagination. So I'm joined today by two colleagues, Dr. Alessandro Bianchi, who is the Bodleian Japanese librarian at Bodleian Libraries, Oxford University, and Dr. Ellis Tinios, visiting researcher at the Art Research Center of Ritsumeikan University in Kyoto. And we will be discussing some of the topics today. I also have an image here of the box the drawings came in, just to give you a sense of the package that we were lucky enough to take possession of last year, and a sense of scale, the drawings there being examined by one of my colleagues. So I would like to turn, first of all, we're going to discuss the broad field of education and knowledge, and how knowledge was acquired and disseminated in Japan. And I'd like to turn first to Dr. Alessandro to give us a little bit of sense of the educational context of Japan in the late 18th, early 19th century, in the decades preceding Hokusai's work on this project. Ale.
Thank you very much. Well, in Tokugawa, Japan, learning and education were no longer a privilege of the elite, and we record an incremental rise in the level of popular literacy. Basic writing and reading skills were acquired not only by clergy and samurai, but also by urban and provincial leaders, merchants, craftsmen, and well-off farmers, and eventually even by the wider population. This was, of course, a long and gradual process that began in the 17th century and continued over a span of almost 300 years. It was facilitated by several factors, most prominently the growth in the number of schools and private academies, and you can see a beautiful visual representations here from a late 18th century book. But also, it was thanks to the endeavors of the government and private individuals who made considerable support in supporting education and the dissemination of knowledge. There was throughout the Tokugawa period a real thirst for knowledge and information. And the rise in the levels of popular literacy meant that more and more people could read books. So unsurprisingly, a thriving publishing market developed from the early 17th century, and it grew exponentially, becoming very competitive in the 18th and 19th centuries. And in the next slide, you can see a picture of how a bookshop would look like, with printed publications put on display together with polychrome prints, and for passers-by to look at and eventually purchase. As the pool of readers grew, commercial publishers made sure that a great variety of titles were available on the market for potential buyers. All the new works of literature were printed and reprinted in various editions and formats, with or without illustrations. But there were also very practical manuals, self-help books, calligraphy copybooks, letter writing manuals, treatises on medicines and anatomy, encyclopedias, and many, many more. Well, it's difficult to summarize in just a few sentences what was available on the market in Tokugawa, Japan. We can glean a very clear picture by looking at the amount of books that survive to these days, but also looking at the very detailed publishers and booksellers catalog, which listed bestsellers as well as new and forthcoming publications.
I think it's important to emphasize the early stage at which this publishing industry develops, as you said, in the 17th century, and then the sheer range, this huge, tremendous range of books, types of books that were available, and very much commercial enterprise, isn't it? That
absolutely
these things sell, and so the more you can sell, the more profit you'll make. But it's a virtuous circle that more and more information is available. I'd like to turn now to Dr. Ellis Tinios and to bring this specifically to Hokusai and how Hokusai was contributing to that large commercial enterprise and what sort of books he was creating illustrations, making content for.
Yes, well, Hokusai was deeply embedded in the publishing industry that Ale sketched for us, and its artists' names helped sell books. So publishers would cultivate particular artists and sometimes gain almost exclusive rights to their work. Not always, but often that would be the case. And you have artists and publishers working very closely together over a period of years. Now, Hokusai's book production, there was a watershed in his book production at around his 50th year, about 1810. Before that,
sorry to interrupt, we should map out Hokusai's dates here, shouldn't we? Born in 17 and died through till 1849, so a tremendously long career.
Yeah. So almost midway, just beyond the midpoint of his career, in his 50s, he changed direction in terms of book illustration. Before that, if we can have the next slide, please, he engaged in the illustration of poetry anthologies, and he provided elegant color-printed images for these books. These were extremely expensive. They would be commissioned by the poets themselves. It was a kind of vanity publishing. But some of these things were so admired that they then went into commercial editions as well. So you can find, for example, this book in some rather sad late printings in which the pigments are not quite right. The color alignment isn't there, but it's still a Hokusai book, and there was a market for it. And he also was illustrating what are called yomihon. These are books for reading. And for these, he provided double-page spreads, as you see here, double-page illustrations that were interspersed into an extended running text. And these stories had high adventure in them, often very bloody deeds, but there was always a kind of retribution at the end, and certain moral principles were emphasized in these reading books. They were extremely popular.
We're familiar with the idea of serialized novels, but what kind of numbers are we talking here in terms of installments?
We could talk of going to 30 volumes or more. They were issued in parts, each of 5 volumes. So your yomihon, you had stacks of them that you had to store. But this is where the rental libraries come in, because not everybody bought every bestseller, but rather they rented them from rental libraries. Anyway, so Hokusai was doing this kind of reading books. And then this shift comes. He continues to do reading books, but mostly, or these novels, but mostly on Chinese themes after his 50th year. And then he started, if we could have the next slide, to come up with books of instruction and drawing. And this is one of his earliest instruction books. And there was a great deal of tremendous amount of whimsy in these small books. They're called what's called shuhon size, half paper size. But here they've been printed on larger paper, so you have very broad margins. And in these books, he is showing you how to draw using the Japanese syllabic script. That's on the right. And on the left, how to use a straight edge and your brush and a compass to create all sorts of wonderfully complex designs. It strikes me that you have to be quite skilled with your brush to be able to realize the instructions that Hokusai is presenting here. But this was a kind of finding his way early in his exploration of kinds of instruction manuals that he could produce. And we find that after 1810, he shifts entirely to the production of didactic books. Some of them were didactic in the sense that they gave you instructions on how to do something, whether it was dancing, which we'll come back to later, or drawing. He also provided designs for craftsmen, but I'm running a little bit ahead of myself on those. But that I think, should we pause right there and say that there's a new beginning in Hokusai, the book illustrator, at this time. And it started with very modest books like the one you see here.
Yeah, but it's an important change in his career and signals what's going to come next, but also to emphasize that element of teaching, that he's trying to disseminate knowledge, information, and ways of doing things to people.
This didactic impulse became incredibly strong in him after his 50th year.
And has to be met by a market that people want to buy these books and the publishers to take these projects forward.
He was the outstanding brand in illustrated books in the 19th century. He came to dominate production, and his books remained in print from the original blocks for a century or more.
There's a tremendous shelf life there, and the longevity of his brand.
Yes. But can I just add that some publishers cut out the publication dates so that the buyers in the 1860s didn't realize they were buying books first published in the 1810s.
Taking off the sell-by date.
That's right.
Equivalent, yeah. Thank you. Ale, turning to you again, can you talk about how within this substantial publishing industry that we've described, and we've heard a little bit about Hokusai's contribution to that and Hokusai's dissemination of knowledge, how was knowledge available to people? How was it disseminated by the people who were the researchers, the scholars, the recipients of information, sometimes from abroad, and how was it made available, or how was it limited, that dissemination limited for the more general public?
Yes, well, there were various channels for information to circulate. There were public lectures, for examples, but one of the major vehicles was indeed the printed word. And a wealth of resources was available to purchase in bookshops or, as Dr. Tinios mentioned before, to borrow from circulating lending libraries. It's called kachihonya. There were specialized manuals produced by scholars for scholars or for aspiring scholars. And you can see an example in this slide here, Shinkan Manbyo Kaishun, one of the many medical treaties for specialists that was produced in Tokugawa, Japan, and that recorded very detailed information about how to recognize and treat a disease, and also added charts. These were books that required a very high level of literacy. In fact, it was written in Chinese with minimal glosses in Japanese, reading aids, really. But because there was such a great interest in learning, and the acquisition of knowledge was such a big pull and a drive for people in the Edo period, publisher recognized that and put on the market a large number of less specialized manuals. And if you go on the next slide, we have an example of books on ornithology and recognition of plants that was written entirely in vernacular Japanese and presented also beautiful illustrations. So it was something useful, easier to read, but also pretty and nice to look at.
Perhaps we should just say a little bit about language in Japan at this time, or language competence in Japan at this time for people who are not familiar.
Absolutely. So there was a multilingualism in Tokugawa, Japan, and although Japanese and vernacular Japanese was the language spoken by everybody, when it comes to the written word, Chinese was or forms of Chinese were very popular in high-level treatises and scholarly works, or Japanese written in ways that it resembled Chinese, but had added reading aids, which allow people with adequate training to decode the sentence and recompose it as if, and read it out loud as if it was Japanese. So these two languages coexisted. And since we were talking about manuals, popular manuals, things that one could find in Edo period, Tokugawa period households, dictionaries were indeed, and Setsuyoshu dictionaries in particular, like the one you see in this image, were indeed one of the most common learning aids for popular households. But there were also compendia like Kozasho, which covered various subjects like etiquette, astrology, common sense knowledge, things that one ought to know, as well as a miscellaneous group of textbooks called Oraimono, which provided, for the most part, models for letter writings, but also various bits and bytes of information about several topics. There were also chohoki, practical handbook written in vernacular Japanese, so aimed at a more general audience that were usually focusing on a broader subject. In this slide, you see an opening from Onna Chohoki, which was a manual of education for women. And you can see that there is an interplay between text and image. You have an illustration of a koto, a musical instrument, with detailed information about its part. It's followed by descriptions on games, matching games with cards and shells. And so it covered useful information, but also quite amusing facts about daily objects. The other kind of publications that I'd like to discuss, and very important indeed when we think about the Great Book of Everything, were illustrated encyclopedias. Generally called kimozui, were very simply structured books with images associated to short textual explanations. And they were very popular in Tokugawa, Japan. The Kimotsui was originally the title of a book produced by, compiled by Nakamura Tekisai, and it was published in 1666. But it was so popular that multiple enlarged editions were produced. And the one that you see, the opening that you see here, it's a late 18th century edition with additional text on top and newly cut images. Kimotsui were so popular that the name of this first illustrated encyclopedia became a way to indicate, to point at illustrated encyclopedia as a whole. And one of the most famous illustrated encyclopedia is the Morokoshi Kimotsui, a general reference work on China that present everything from landscape, historical figures, technology used in China. And it was really a reference guide for people who wanted to know more about what was happening in the continent.
Thank you. There's a tremendous amount of information there on so many levels, available through so many different types of books. Ellis, can I ask you to speak very...
First, could I just say one thing to point out? That because these books were all produced by cut wood blocks, it was possible to combine your text and image.
You read my mind. That was my question.
Okay, on every single page. And I think that's very important that our audience understand that. And it's not the problem that you had in Europe, where you got your best images using intaglio printing, but you wanted your text from relief printing. So that, as we'll see at the end of our session today with Diderot's encyclopedia, the fine images had to be produced separately from the text and were actually bound in separate volumes. This was never a problem that was faced in the production of Japanese books.
Yeah, so everything's... That was my question, just to explain,
okay.
To point out to people, to viewers, that this is a combinatory process, that the words and the images are being cut into the block at the same time. And that gives tremendous flexibility within the image field, or the book opening, that 2-page scope. You can do any combination.
Yes.
Moving back to Hokusai specifically, we've heard a little bit from Alessandro about the broader, the types of information, the types of knowledge that are being made available through these books. But Hokusai specifically, this didactic impulse that you talked about, can you drill down deeper into that, and what takes him on this trajectory towards the great picture book of everything and its encyclopedic attempt?
Yeah. Yes. Well, when you study Hokusai's books, you're just amazed at this sudden burst of creativity and productivity that carried on right through his 70s. His 50s, 60s, and 70s were really his most productive years. And so if we look here, we see, for example, openings from the first and second volumes of the manga. Now, the manga themselves, we can call them Hokusai sketches. I think that's a good translation of those two words. And on the left is from volume 1.
Do you want to zoom in this image to make it larger for people?
Could we have this larger? Yes, that would be very good if we could have it fill the whole screen, because there's so much in this. And
we encourage people to browse online as well.
Pardon me?
We encourage people to browse images online.
Yes. So the first manga volume was encyclopedic in the sense that it began with human figures, beginning with historical figures and mythic figures, and then going on to scenes of daily life. So the opening here is quite typical. On the right-hand page, on the top left, you have women who are diving for abalone. Whereas to the right of them, 2 boys are playing on an anchor on a beach. If we go to the top of the left page, we have 2 shipwrights hard at work. And then in the top left corner, we have 2 block cutters who produced the kinds of blocks that were needed to print this book. Now, the book was published. Yeah. We could do a whole hour just on that one image. But the manga were published in line with light gray and light pink. That was far less expensive than a multicolored book. It was more expensive than a book that was just in line only. Nonetheless, it added very much of the appeal of the book. And this whole range of instruction manuals that Hokusai produced, reference books were produced in this format. Now, the first volume of the manga was supposed to be standalone, but then it was so popular that they decided to produce more volumes. The first volume went from human figures to animals, to plants, to critters, to landscapes. But actual objects made by man were not its central focus. But he made up for that in the second volume of the manga, where you see this extraordinary desire to encompass everything imaginable within the pages of these books. So you see there we have various kinds of pots and bottles. We have metal vessels on the left. We have tools on the top left. So this is an indication already in 1814, 1815 of his appetite for objects and details and wanting to record them as accurately as possible. Should we go to the next slide, please, then? And this is from volume 11 or part 11 of the manga. And he wanted to encompass, again, everything. I'm sorry, I'm repeating myself on this, but here we have...
It's in the title, it's okay. The Great Picture Book of Everything.
Everything,
Not
yes.
of this book, but of the drawings.
You can see many resonances with the block-ready drawings of the Great Picture Book, the unpublished Great Picture Book. But we have here Portuguese who introduced firearms to Japan using firearms. And we see on the right-hand side, on the left page at the bottom, we have a hunter hidden in a hide, taking aim at that goose. And above, we have a fish that's been shot in the water. And we have your various accoutrements that go with using my muskets on the right page of the left-hand opening of the book that we show you here. So it wasn't just nature and things Japanese, but he would include exotic foreign details. Could we have the next image as well? And these are from manga 11 again on the left. A detailed rendering of a pistol, identifying all its parts. And then on the right, in the foreground, we have a loom for weaving silk. And in the back, we have an apparatus for unraveling the silkworm cocoons to get the filaments that were then spun into the thread that would be used on the loom to produce the silk. There was nothing that he did not consider worthy of his brush. Could you go to the next slide, please? Here we have, again, resonances with the Great Picture Book of Everything drawings, block-ready drawings. On the left, the figures. There are many sheets in the Great Picture Book of Everything that show us individuals set out in that way. They are all, I believe, foreigners, aren't they? There are very few Japanese that appear in those panels. Whereas on the left, we have the four classes of Japanese society: the samurai, the peasant, the artisan, and the merchant, who was a fishmonger. And this is from Ehon Teikin Orai, an instruction manual for children that was enhanced by Hokusai's illustrations throughout. And on the top, the text is presented in a very flamboyant style, but provided with reading aids in very fine text in between the columns, as you see. And I chose the opening on the right because it's a theme that we'll be coming back to, and that is Hokusai's representation of China, because what we have there is a street in Edo, present-day Tokyo, and the shop sells objects from China. And here it's a matter of decorative objects, as you can see. This pays very close study, the details in the background of that shop. Could we go to the next slide, please? And then in 1836, I designed this extraordinary book on carpentry. And carpentry had sacred overtones. The carpenters on the left resemble priests. And above, he's got outlines of proportions for roof lines. And on the right, he has this ritual portico for a Shinto shrine. But as you can see, he's giving us these highly technical drawings. The detail is extraordinary in them. But he gives us the human touch. There is the priest on the right, which we might expect, but he had to include the groundskeeper, sweeping the grounds of the shrine. And he's always giving human interest to his books. Next, please. And in the early 1820s, he produced 3 volumes of designs for artisans to use to decorate combs first, which you see on the top. And we have on the right 2 examples of the kinds of combs these decorations were intended for. And then also for pipes and below, because Japanese pipes had a thick stem, and these designs were to go around that stem. And each of those combs on the top that you see there are no more than 10 centimeters across. The fine detail in this book is extraordinary. It's a tour de force of both his design, his inventiveness, and the skill of block cutters who could realize his intentions in this way.
And this is the format, it's worth mentioning, isn't it? The format that the Great Picture Book of Everything would have been published in.
Would have been, had the book been published, this is the format it would have been in.
Small horizontal book.
Yes. Next, please. And then this is a book that's always, students I've taught have always found this very appealing. It's How to Dance. And you have these extended sequences and they're numbered. So for example, on the right example opening, we start with the 10th move and then go on through to the, how do we take that through? Anyway, so we're midway through the dance in both instances. And let's do the close-up on the left side, please.
Yeah, it's just, I was going to say, it's going along the top in that right-hand opening, and then
right to left. That's right.
The lower
right to left, below, you go below again, yeah. And then here you can just see. And he's imbued his figures in this with these wonderful kind of expressions and liveliness, but he's giving you a very accurate account of how you could perform particular dances.
It's amazing. I think many people will be unaware, wouldn't even have imagined that Hokusai was designing dance manuals.
Exactly, yes.
I wonder if anybody's tried to do a reenactment.
such spirit in them, such life in them, yes.
Yeah.
Should we move on? Yeah.
Thank you. It is.
Well, that gives us I think a sense, an overview of the range that this man.
Yeah, and we're still just touching on the depth of what Hokusai was creating, the types of images, the types of books that he was channeling all of this, his knowledge and all of this information into to create attractive, desirable books for people to purchase and enjoy, leafing through casually or applying this knowledge. You can imagine that somebody was really trying seriously to learn dancing, and you can buy a manual from Hokusai, and it's the best person to create those images.
His creative urge was just extraordinary. It was irrepressible.
Unstoppable.
Yeah.
Alessandro, turning back to you, we've mentioned briefly, both of you have mentioned briefly the position of China with regard to Japanese culture at this time and production of cultural works like the books. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of China for Japan at this time, Chinese culture, and the situation with travel?
Okay. Well, China always played an important part in Japanese culture, and in the 17th century, there was an even larger interest in China as a country, but also Chinese studies, especially among circles of scholars and intellectuals. Numerous books were imported into the continent and were republished in Japan, either as is, so as Japanese editions of Chinese books, or by adding reading aids, translations, or heavy annotations. The book that you see here, the opening, is from a very famous encyclopedic work that, although it's written in Chinese with reading aids, was actually compiled by a Japanese medical doctor, Terajima Ryoan, in 1712. And this book was created with in mind a Chinese encyclopedic work called Sansai Zue, it was in fact aptly named Wakan Sansaizue, or Sino-Japanese Sansaizue. That included, on top of the information published in the original Chinese work, additions that Terajima added, talking about Japan, but also from other books that were imported again from China, especially Honzo Komoku, one of the most famous pharmacopoeia, and other manuals. If one was interested in the pursuit of art and wanted to learn how to paint in Chinese styles, could have access to these informations through Japanese editions of painting manuals, like the Mustard Seed Garden Manual of Painting, which you see represented here. Again, the knowledge of Chinese was a prerequisite to access the text. In this specific edition, there are no reading aids. So interest in China and in Chinese culture also required, in many cases, the knowledge of Chinese language, especially when you were dealing with these kind of more academic publications. The study and interpretation of the Chinese classics was also of paramount importance, especially among circles of Confucian scholars like Ogyosorai and Ito Jinsai, who widely engage with linguistic studies, philology, as well as translations, as a way to improve the understanding of the original text. Ogyosorai is a particularly interesting case, as you saw translations as a very dynamic act, and he advocated strongly for learning contemporary vernacular Chinese in order to better understand the classical text. And he went to the extent of founding the Translation Society, or Yaksha, to provide a place for learning and speaking vernacular Chinese. Travel to China was not, as you can imagine, a simple thing. So these scholars had access to this kind of information thanks to import books and manuals. But publishers made sure that there were easier versions with translations and explanations that were aimed at a less educated readership. And here is an example of ehon kokyo, or an illustrated version of the classical Philippaiti, that present Chinese text, the bold characters in a cartouche, with translations on the side, glosses that provide translations, but also very detailed annotation in vernacular Japanese, and of course, beautiful illustrations that make the book even more pleasant. There was also a growing interest in vernacular Chinese literature that was available in Japanese translations and later on adaptations, especially in the 18th and 19th century. And we know that Hokusai played a big role in producing the illustrations for these works.
Thank you. We have to explain, we have to emphasize, don't we, that all of this knowledge is coming in from outside Japan through books, because Japanese people at this time are not allowed to travel. And you have substantial Chinese trade coming in through Nagasaki. So there are Chinese men entering Japan, and that trade is bringing in books that, as you've described, are then translated, adapted, republished, reworked, augmented. But Japanese cannot leave Japan. As this lockdown, 250-year period of lockdown, as Tim Clark has described it. And so books are essential to understand what's going on in the outside world, and there's some information coming in from further afield, from Europe as well, through books. The import restrictions are relaxed in 1720, and European books are allowed in, provided they don't deal with Christianity, because underlying all of this restriction on travel is a fear of colonization by Western powers and a fear of the reach of the Catholic Church in particular. So taking up or continuing with that theme of China, Ellis, can you tell us about how China manifests itself in Hokusai's work?
It's an extraordinary phenomenon. Hokusai became the illustrator of choice for books in China in the 1820s and the 1830s. He first made his mark as early as 1805 with the novel The Water Margin, which was being translated into Japanese and was proving very popular. And this book that we have on display here was produced in 1829. And in this book, he wanted to demonstrate the way that you should depict Chinese warriors. He complained in the preface that he wrote in Chinese that nobody in China or Japan knows the right way to depict warriors.
And these are ancient Chinese warriors.
Pardon me?
Are they ancient Chinese warriors that we're talking about here?
No, the books that came through. He was looking at the warriors in these books. He says, there's no spirit in them. This is you have to give them life, spirit, force. And he also did classics like the classic of filial piety. And Alice showed us an example that he said had beautiful images. Well, I think, with all due respect, Hokusai's were even more fantastic. And an advert by the publisher is addressed to parents and say, if you buy this book for your children, they won't get bored while they're studying the classic of filial piety. And he worked with the translator, the scholar, the sinologist, Takai Ranzan, on a very impressive series of books in the 1820s and the 1830s. Could we go to the next slide, please? These are some more illustrations from the Water Margin. And I've chosen the one on the right in particular because you can see the great detail of that Hokusai provides, and it's all accurately Chinese. And I sometimes think maybe he wandered to that shop I showed you earlier that sold Chinese goods in Edo to see what the latest imports were, to see what kinds of bowls and pots were being used. Exactly. Could we move on, please, then? And then a major project that he contributed to was the Toshi Sen ehon, which is an illustrated book of Tang Dynasty poetry. And this ran to 7 parts. Each part was in 5 volumes. And it began around 1790, the publication of this book, and various artists illustrated parts, 5-volume parts. Hokusai was finally brought in the mid-1830s to contribute the entire 6th and 7th part of this illustrated Tang poetry. So we have 10 remarkable volumes in which Hokusai was responding to the Chinese poems. But once again, we're seeing this China of his imagination. I like to describe it as a kind of virtual China that Hokusai created through his close study of artifacts and books, illustrated books from China. Should we move? And then these are just 2 more shots showing you the range, the imaginative range that he brought to these illustrations.
Do you have a total number of illustrations in these books, a rough figure for how many visions of China did he create?
Just Toshi Sen, he must have had about 60 images there. And then he did another book that was not published until 1881. That's another story that would have had another 100 drawings. We're talking many hundreds of book plates of China.
But just to give a sense that this is 3 illustrations from maybe 60 in this one publication.
It's one publication, exactly. And think that the Water Margins novel ran to multiple volumes as well. It was extraordinary.
Ale, turning back to you, let's get to the drawings and give a little bit more focus to them. Can you talk about the range of content for this great picture book of everything, at least the 103 drawings that we now have in the British Museum that are on display?
Yes. So the over 100 drawings that constitute the great picture books of everything covers an array of different topics, from the representation of the natural world, which includes pictures of flora and fauna, as well as fantastic creatures and supernatural beings, but also the pictures of people and some landscapes of foreign lands. And it is worth mentioning that this is, in fact, one of the biggest parts of the drawings, and roughly 2/3, according to Dr. Clark studies, 2/3 of these pictures depict scenes or characters from China and India. And in this, Buddhism and Buddhist figures also play an important part. And in these slides, you can see roughly a sort of an overview of all these this array of different topics that you can find in the drawings. As we talk about the content, it's interesting, I think, to look at potential sources of inspiration for this encyclopedic instinct that Hokusai displayed. And here are just 2 suggestions. I'm not proposing that this was the original source of inspirations, but I just would like to show some of the similarities in the arrangement of rocks, minerals, and gemstones that you can see here between one of the illustrated encyclopedias, the Kimozui that we discussed earlier on, and 2 drawings that show similar arrays of corals and rocks. The same similar arrangement can also be seen in representations of birds and animals. And if we can go to the next slide.
I just wanted,
yes,
if you can tell us very briefly, the bottom left of that lower image, there's a lovely detail there, isn't there?
Yes, that is a magnetic stone, and it really shows Hokusai's artistic prowess and creativity. It shows magnetic stones with nails and other metal tools attached to it, and it's much more the visual immediacy of that image. It's so much more powerful than the same rock depicted in the Kimozui, which is on the left. On the right side of the slides, at the center bottom, it's just a standard stone that doesn't really tell us much unless we go and read the text above. But in Hokusai's picture, just a simple picture tells a whole story.
Showing rather than telling.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is just, again, another very simple comparison between illustrated manual on ornithology, show a cluster of birds, and the way that Hokusai similarly arranged his own composition. The third slide in this series shows different ethnic groups, different peoples, and in a way, these Bankoku Jinbutsu books and scrolls that were produced and printed both in print and manuscript format in the Edo period shows very similar arrays of peoples, and they also add descriptions. Now, Hokusai shortened this to present only one example for each group. So in a way, it's a much more condensed representations, but perhaps there might have been some inspirations coming from these manuals. And it's interesting to notice at the very bottom that there is also a fantastic creature, a person with very long leg, which at the time was thought to be people living on a specific island. So they were listed together with people from India, China, and Korea. And by the way, the book presents people from Korea, and you can see a comparison with the first image on the top in Hokusai's drawing.
Top left of that upper image.
Thank you.
Yeah, and it's important to emphasize here that these are creatures real and imagined, people real and imagined, and people in Japan would not have seen many of those creatures and would not have seen many of those people. So there's no hard and fast boundary between what's real and imagined in the way that we might seek that boundary, or we might expect it to be there. And
Absolutely, and Kimodzui and Wakan Saizui, all these encyclopedias also recorded all these fantastic creatures. So they were part of the common knowledge that were available through manuals and reference work at the time.
Ellis, I know you have thoughts about that fantastical, whimsical side to Hokusai that you see in his books earlier on, and these are two of the drawings that show the man with the incredibly the creature, the man with the incredibly long neck, and then the long armed man on the right.
The long and the giant holding the pygmy, so it's like Gulliver's Travels on the far right, and then the long-armed man complements the long-legged man that we saw on the previous slide. But these are not unique to the 103 drawings. If you go ahead, we'll see in Hokusai Manga 12, we find the same people, those wonderful long-necked creatures, and then the long-limbed people on the right. So this was a kind of fantasy world that he loved to explore, and he gave it incredible conviction. I find, for example, if you can see it, could we enlarge this slide just briefly for a moment? Because we have a three-eyed ogre on the left, and he's being offered a triple lens spectacles to accommodate all three of his eyes. It's this kind of imagination and attention to detail that's so wonderful about Hokusai. We can
point out that the long-necked man is that a woman actually, now that I'm looking at that more closely?
I think they're both women,
yeah. In the drawing it's a man, but in this Hokusai manga it's a woman, that she's going over to the other side of the room to get a light for a pipe.
That's right.
I just popped back there, so the man on the left-hand drawing there is getting a light for his pipe from his friend.
And notice the gentleman in the middle there has got long earlobes, incredibly long earlobes that he's holding up.
Like a scarf, yes.
Yeah. And then just quickly, the figure on the right, the very long-legged gentleman is undergoing moxibustion. He's having burning incense placed on his acupuncture points on his legs.
Mm-hmm. All real-life scenarios.
Yes, another domestic touch. Should we go on then?
Ale, can I ask you how these drawings would have been used, what their role would have been?
Yes, these were drawings not supposed to be looked at as we are doing today. The very reason they survive, as you mentioned at the beginning, it's because the book was never actually realized. These were block-ready drawings that were supposed to be used to create the blocks, the wood blocks, then used for printing. And you can see here a very quick overview of how the printing and the bookmaking process worked. And on the top right side, you have the writers. On the top left side, you have the artists creating the illustrations. So the drawings that we see are the drawings realized, are the preparatory, the final sketches created by Hokusai for the block cutter, then to create the printing blocks that would look like this one, with the pages cut onto the blocks, and the block would have been inked. If we can go on the next slide. So you see here the block cutters preparing using these draft on extremely fine paper, pasting them on a plank of wood and cutting them with extreme precision.
Should we zoom in here?
Full screen, yeah.
Once the block were ready, they were passed on to the next stage, to the printers, who would ink the block, and by pressing a white sheet of paper with a tool called baren. If we can move to the next slide, thank you. The image would have transferred, the inked block would transfer a pattern onto the white page, yes. And that sheet of paper would have then, if you go to the next page, would have been folded in half with a printed side outward, and then using the page number, they would be put in right order and sewn together to create something that looks like this. This is a book for the first volume of Hokusai Manga, but as Dr. Tinios suggested before, the drawings that were prepared for this particular book would have resulted in a landscape orientation, so look more or less like this, with the binding on the side. Now, I'm conscious about time. We could go on and talk about this for much longer, but I think we reach a good.
You had one more image there.
Yes, and then of course the final product would have been put to the bookshop, and as you can see, everybody would like to purchase them.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So I wanted to mention, and Ellis, you mentioned it earlier, about comparable projects. There are others around the world, but we are most familiar here in Europe with the Encyclopédie of Diderot. That I think is the closest parallel we have, perhaps, and it in terms of this quest to contain all of this encyclopedic knowledge, to gain control of it and then disseminate it. And this was a project in France between 1751 and 1772 that was edited by Denis Diderot and Louis de Jaucourt, that had many writers, famous figures such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Voltaire, and was really revolutionary, credited with sparking the Enlightenment, or as part of that larger Enlightenment urge, but very controversial because it had heterodox and anti-clerical content to it that the authors ran considerable risks creating this publication. So I think it's got a different position culturally from Hokusai's great picture book of everything, because the knowledge that he's trying to encapsulate in his work doesn't have that dangerous quality to it. It's an accepted elite form of information that's coming in from China to a large extent, and it's to do with Buddhism, whereas this was more controversial. As you can see in the image there, it was multi-volume, 28 volumes with 72,998 articles. And you mentioned, Ellis, that there's this difference in production as well, that this Diderot's encyclopédie, the text volumes were produced first, and then the images had to be produced separately. And there's a couple of images there of both technology and natural history from some of the thousands available. So it's interesting to think of these in parallel. There were encyclopedic projects, certainly, as Ale has described earlier in Japan, at the same time as this, prior to Hokusai. Ellis, do you have any thoughts on this encyclopedic urge within Europe and how it compares?
I think, considering the time that we have, I'd like to just comment a bit on why the book wasn't published.
Sure, yeah, we need to think about that a little bit. Very this is my favorite image as a holding image.
Yes, I wasn't at all surprised that we have these block-ready drawings that the book never went into production, because if you look at the publishing history of Hokusai's books in the 1820s, the 1830s, and into the 40s, we have numerous cases in which a 3-volume work only had 1 volume published, and then there was a hiatus of 10, 15 years, and then the 2nd and 3rd volumes were produced. And we also have evidence of other books that never went beyond the block-ready drawing stage. And we also have an example of a book that Hokusai completed in the mid-1830s. The block-ready drawings were preserved, and they were used to cut fresh printing blocks in 1879, and the book was published in 1880. So there is nothing whatsoever unusual about having block-ready drawings like this preserved. I think there isn't time to even begin touching upon the economic reasons why this might have been the case, but the publishers were having a hard time in the 1820s and 30s. Hokusai was a very, very demanding artist, and he had to have the very best block cutters who cost a lot of money to cut these extraordinary designs. So the publishers may have just looked at these drawings and said, we just can't do them now. it might have saved them for a better time that never came. But that's about all I think I can squeeze into what we have left.
I'll mention here that we have another event coming up on November the 5th that focuses on Hokusai's late works, the block-ready drawings, and I think that will go into more detail about the production story of this particular book. But we are thinking about the broader field of knowledge here. Thank you both very much. I think I'm going to, if I may indulge you for a couple more minutes, we can move to some of the questions. Two in particular that are important, but I think you can speak to about the audience for the Great Book of Everything and rates of literacy. Maybe we can take those reverse order. Ale, can I give you the literacy question?
Yes. So very briefly, would all classes of Japanese be literate? Eventually, yes, but of course that was a gradual process, and until the late 19th century, merchants, for example, or people with practical that had practical needs for being able to draft documents, for example, or a need of numeracy skills, clearly had, and also had the economic possibilities to go to school and improve their understanding of more complex subjects, had clearly a higher level of literacies. But by the end of the 19th century, it is estimated that most groups of even commoners had basic literacy skills.
Thank you. And Ellis, can you speculate or give us some thoughts on who the audience for this great picture book of everything would have been?
Well, I think it could have been anybody who was interested in the wider world. I think the only restraint would have been the cost of purchasing the book had it been produced. But I think it had a universal appeal, and it actually didn't require a high level of literacy. You just enjoyed the pictures. There wasn't a running text. And even if you didn't know all these Chinese characters, the figures who were being depicted and couldn't read their names, it really didn't matter. You got caught up in the excitement of the images themselves. So that's the broadest kind of audience, but there would have been others who were.
And there were lending libraries as well, so you didn't necessarily have to buy the book.
Of course, you rent it from a lending library. Yes.
Can we just go to the final, back to the slide presentation for the final image? There we go. This is the book that has been published by Timothy Clark on the drawings. So we encourage you to come to the exhibition itself to see the drawings themselves. And you can buy this book in the British Museum online shop it has full-scale reproductions, full-size reproductions of all of the drawings, and then the essay and explanatory text by Tim Clark. But I'd like to thank today Dr. Alessandro Bianchi and Dr. Ellis Tinios very much for contributing their knowledge and their information on the field of knowledge in Japan in Hokusai's time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Okay.